The European Union's new migration policy comes into force. The sweeping pact aims to tighten border controls and change asylum rules. But will it deter people from seeking refuge in Europe? And what role have the bloc's politics played? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Anna Burns-Francis. It's called the European Union Pact on Migration and Asylum, and it took effect on Friday. The policy is the culmination of years of tough negotiations between member states on how to handle incoming asylum seekers and other migrants. The pact is being described as the most significant overhaul of Europe's migration rules to date, and it introduces stricter measures for people who want to enter the EU. Human rights groups and the left say the reforms could undermine the rights of people seeking refuge, but the right says the new policy doesn't go far enough. In a moment, we'll discuss with our guests the challenges Brussels is facing to implement this pact. But first, this report from Ferdia Carr.
The European Union is implementing a sweeping overhaul of its migration rules. The Pact on Migration and Asylum aims to tighten controls at Europe's borders, with quick, mandatory screening for migrants through an EU-wide database, faster returns for people whose asylum claims are rejected, and a so-called solidarity mechanism, compelling member states to either relocate asylum seekers where most arrive, like Italy and Greece, or provide other aid. Immigration has been an increasingly divisive issue across Europe, in both the EU and non-member states. Earlier this week, a knife attack in the northern Irish city of Belfast triggered violence, with masked attackers targeting homes they believe belong to foreign-born residents. And anti-immigrant sentiment has led to a surge in support for far-right parties across the EU. That largely began after 2015, when record numbers of asylum seekers began arriving in Europe. They were fleeing war and instability in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan and elsewhere. Scenes of families arriving on overcrowded boats or drowning in the attempt to cross led to calls for them to be allowed safe passage. The same year, Germany allowed more than 1 million asylum seekers to enter the country. Now, the far-right anti-immigration AfD party leads opinion polls. Mainstream parties there and across Europe are increasingly appealing to anti-immigration sentiment.
In the last 13 months, EU colleagues have told me the German attitude was the problem, that they wanted to go much further to enforce stricter regulations in Europe, that Germany was the brake on that. Well, we're no longer slowing down the train. Now we're in the driver's seat.
EU researchers also warn that misinformation online is fueling anti-migrant views. For European leaders, the pact is more than an overhaul of asylum-seeking procedures. It's an attempt to convince increasingly sceptical voters that the bloc is responding to their concerns. But rights groups say it may jeopardise the rights of those seeking protection. Ferdia Carr, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
All right, let's bring in our guests for today. Marta Welander is EU Advocacy Director at International Rescue Committee. She joins us from Brussels. Nathalie Tocci is a Professor of Practice at Johns Hopkins University, SAIS Europe. She's joining us from Rome. And Pieter Cleppe is Editor-in-Chief at BrusselsReport.eu, also joining us from Brussels. Welcome to each of you. Thank you. Marta, can I start with you? Does Europe have an immigration problem?
Thank you very much for having me. I think it's certainly safe to say that there was a need for an overhaul of the previous system in how the EU and its member states approached migration and asylum. I think, of course, there was a need to ensure that there wasn't a disproportionate responsibility laid upon the countries of first entry, such as Italy, Spain, Cyprus, Greece. There was also a strong need to find solutions for the inadequate reception facilities and capacity and asylum processing systems. And indeed a need for safe and legal pathways. So in that sense, indeed, there were shortcomings and issues in the EU's previous approach. But I think what we're concerned about here is that the pact that now will start being implemented, that it may not provide durable solutions to these issues in ways that also uphold fundamental rights and international refugee law.
Yeah. Nathalie, can I ask you, you are in Rome, so you are in Italy, one of the countries that is geographically the front line as it stands for this issue. But the EU has dozens of state members. Has this been a failing on behalf of other countries not to support those that are that first line for refugees arriving on the shores of the European continent?
I mean, if you look at the number of asylum seekers in general, of also migrants in Italy compared to other European countries, particularly North European countries, actually still today there is a much, much higher number of both refugees and migrants in North European countries. So if you're simply looking at this as a question of overall numbers, then actually no. Now, of course, there has been a moment, a turning point, because, once upon a time, if we go back to the 1990s, to the early 2000s, actually the direction that migrants and refugees came into Europe was actually fairly, in a sense, distributed, right? I mean, there were migrants, particularly in the 1990s, refugees coming from the Balkans. Then, of course, there was Afghanistan, the Middle East, Africa. So the geographical distribution was really rather varied, particularly after the Arab uprisings. Particularly given that the Arab uprisings essentially came just before just before the sovereign debt crisis in Europe, which, as we know, hit particularly southern Europe. What you end up having in those years, so, starting 2011, 12, 13, 14, is basically, on the one hand, this flux that is particularly coming from sub-Saharan Africa through North Africa, given that it is going through a moment of destabilization in the context of the Arab uprisings, which then, of course, arrives at the first port of arrival, which are southern European countries, which in those years were undergoing an economic crisis. So that's the moment in which basically the mechanism, right, let's call it the implicit social contract on migration in Europe breaks, right? And it's really been since then that Europeans have been on the search for a new model. Now, of course, the problem, and as indeed, we were beginning to discuss a moment ago, the problem is that this all happens also at a time in which there is this first wave of growing nationalist populism in Europe, and then, of course, the second wave, which is what we're in now. And so, in a sense, there are pretty good reasons why, of course, the underlying contract governing both asylum and migration in Europe need to be rethought. But that rethinking is happening in a fundamentally different political climate in Europe, which ends up with the solutions which we're probably going to end up talking about in just one moment.
Yeah, Pieter, can I bring you in here? Because Nathalie's point is that this is a migration that has been happening for years and years and years. And yet we are in a moment of increased nationalism and more populism in politics. And so why now has this become the propelling moment for a change in the way the Union does handle migration?
Well, I think slowly we have seen voters increasingly supporting immigration-critical political forces, or rather forces that want an end to some of the chaos that we've seen. Last year, still, despite the progress, still 200,000 people entered illegally into the EU. So, in a way, this debate is not even about do we want more migrants or less, or more asylum seekers or less. It's about making sure that the democratic policy choices on who is allowed to enter and who is not are respected.
Marta, can I come to you? Because there is that issue of being a migrant or being undocumented or being quote unquote illegal. How much crossover is there really in terms of people who reach European shores or borders and claim that they need asylum? And how much of it is a problem when people become undocumented or, quote unquote, overstay and become illegal?
Well, we know from working with communities and individuals across Europe, and in fact across the entire arc of displacement, that most people, of course, wish to go through legal routes. They wish to enter the system and become regularized. And in fact, of course, under international law and under refugee law, each person has the right to have their case individually and adequately assessed, with the legal safeguards and with assistance to that. What we see much of the time is that people are trapped in lengthy asylum procedures because our reception and asylum systems are under-resourced, and there's a lot of strain on countries of first entry. And it therefore happens that sometimes people move on through secondary movements and may get lost in the system. So it's of course essential now that further resources are allocated to be able to process each and individual claim for asylum adequately and see who has a solid claim for asylum, who is eligible for international protection.
Nathalie, can I pick up on the point there about the allocation of resources here? Because when we look back over the years, I think 2015, it was called a migrant crisis. And there was an argument at the time that the huge influx, the numbers as they were, I think political scientist Cleppe said, was it really a crisis? Because he argued that Europe had the financial resources to deal with this, and yet it didn't, is his argument. But also, may I suggest that it hasn't up until today?
Well, I mean, absolutely. In fact, the migration crisis has never really been a crisis about migration. It's a political crisis about migration. So it is not really about the actual flows, which even at their peak were, frankly speaking, for, one of the richest continents on earth, Europe of almost 500 million people, of course that they can deal with an influx, even when it reached a peak of 3 million or something a year, right? So of course it's manageable. I mean, particularly honestly, if you compare it to the influx of refugees within the African country, within the Middle Eastern region. I mean, just think about the percentage of refugees in a country like Lebanon, right? So it's actually even shocking to use the word crisis when referring to it in terms of migration per se. Now, it has, of course, constituted a political crisis. It's been a crisis of solidarity within the Union, and it's been, of course, a major crisis of international solidarity vis-a-vis, indeed, the refugees and the migrants themselves, right? So it's a political crisis, and that political crisis has been both fed by and has in turn been feeding essentially the political crisis that is encapsulated by indeed what Cleppe works on, which is the rise of nationalist populism in Europe.
Yeah, and so Pieter, if it is a political crisis, is this pact really the right approach to tackle it?
Well, there's good side, there's bad sides. Honestly, I think to redistribute people within a passport-free zone, the Schengen zone, and to present that as a solution for some of the, the migration pressures or the lack of quick procedures or safe pathways is just bizarre. And now we see countries like Poland basically refusing to implement that. And Poland is led by pro-EU governments, by Mr. Tusk. So honestly, I think a lot more can be expected from a different legal measure that is currently being negotiated, the returns regulation, which will for the first time allow EU countries to negotiate return hubs, which means that people entering illegally and then seeing their asylum request denied and then refusing to go back to their country of origin risk being sent over there, which may have quite an effect. At least that's what we see in a way what has worked in Australia. The Australian system is not perfect, but if you compare the number of people dying at sea in Europe, that was, I think, 30,000 people in the last decades, compared to Australia, clearly it is a lot more humane to do it in this way, and people are not being duped by human smugglers also. Of course, on top of that, you do need legal pathways, but those need to be restricted by the democratic choices of the European voters, of course.
The problem is, though, that is when populism and rhetoric comes into it, isn't it, Marta? That the voice of the people is not perhaps an accurate reflection of the situation or the issue or the means to solve it.
No, absolutely. And I think the return regulation that the previous speaker just referred to, I think it cannot be seen as a humane solution. We see it as a systematic dismantling, if anything, of protections and a significant setback for rights. It will be one of the most punitive immigration instruments that we have seen in recent EU history. It will lead to significantly ramped up deportation powers for EU member states. It's likely to lead to immigration raids, not only in people's homes, but potentially also within NGO facilities like ours. People will be uprooted from their communities where they may have lived now for several years in EU member states. Families will be torn apart likely, and people will be held in prison-like conditions. The Article 17 return hubs, I mean, these are bound to be legal black holes, offshore detention facilities. So I think it's important not to brush over this and refer to the return regulation as a humane system when it certainly isn't. We need to bear in mind the human realities of these policies and how they will affect individuals and communities who have come to Europe to seek protection.
Nathalie, can I bring you in here? And perhaps you have some thoughts on this as well. They're called offshore return hubs. By another name, I assume most people would consider them a detention centre of sorts. Do you see it as problematic that Europe is outsourcing this to a third-party country, if I'm trying to use the most neutral language?
Well, I mean, of course, it's absolutely problematic. If we want to see a silver lining in this, in a weird way, it is that I don't think it will actually be implemented. And I don't think it will be implemented because in order for it to be implemented, what you need to have is those willing third countries. They may be terrible human rights violating countries, but they have to be terrible human rights violating countries that are actually willing to do this for the EU. Now, there may be a very short list of awful countries that are willing to do this, but it's an extremely short list because they need to get something in return, right? And, let's just take the example of Italy, Albania, right? So maybe you can have a country which is actually not awful. I mean, Albania, in the big scheme of things, it's definitely not an awful country. But, so Italy has been trying to do this. But Albania is, in a sense, more the exception than the norm, because we know that Albania, not only does it have, sort of long historical ties to Italy, and it therefore, in a sense, wants to be nice to Italy, but above all, Albania wants to enter the European Union. So even if, and of course, as we know, those extraterritorial asylum processing centres in Albania are still not functioning after basically 4 years of a far-right government in Italy that promised that this would be its kind of, big thing. And they're still not working because of all sorts of legal problems related to it. But even if they were to work, as I said, it's connected to a particular demand that Albania has of entering the European Union. What Albania says is, if in 2 years' time we're actually within the European Union, of course we're going to stop doing this, right? So, and as I said, Albania is just one of those few countries which is actually willing to do this. Frankly speaking, I can't think of any other country that so far has signaled a willingness to be part of this scheme, right? So the EU can pass all the laws that it wants, all the pacts that it wants, doesn't necessarily mean, in brackets, thankfully, that it will actually be implemented.
Pieter, the other two speakers have raised some valid points, and there has been criticism already that in countries the likes of Libya and Tunisia, which do see an influx of migrants waiting to make their journey, there are camps and there is recorded, documented cases of terrible assault and violence and all sorts of terrible crimes that occur. What responsibility does the European Union have, or should it have then, if it insists on having these offshore detention centres or hubs as a place to return to once people leave Europe?
Well, evidently, such hubs should remain under EU's jurisdiction. All the human rights standards should be respected there. If you look at Australia, they have not implemented it in a perfect way, but they did manage to stop the chaos. They did manage to avoid those mass drownings at sea that we've witnessed in Europe, the chaos. So, I mean, also the left-leaning political forces in Australia have been supporting this over, I think, almost 2 decades now. So what I think is that if you care about migration, if you care about asylum, and if you care about avoiding that the public turns against all of this, then you should be even more keen to stop the large-scale violation of migration policy, of the democratic choices made by European governments on who's allowed to enter and who's not allowed to enter. And I think at the moment, correct me if I'm wrong, 80% or 2/3 of people that are told they cannot remain in the EU, they remain anyway. From a democratic point of view, this I think is a great problem. But also, if you care about migration and public support for migration, I think you should be alarmed by that, and it should be a priority to do something about it.
It's an interesting point you raised there, because you're tying one concept to another, if I've interpreted that right, that if you care about it, you have to do it a certain way. But as we see consistently, there are lots of different voices that have an opinion on this. Pope Leo has just been in Spain addressing a crowd that did include migrants. He said it is not enough to manage arrivals, distribute statistics, reinforce borders, or lament deaths after they have occurred. You, he said to the migrants, are not just numbers or files. You are people who have left behind families and homes. You have dreams that no one has the right to despise. Marta, I feel like you probably have quite a connection to this concept of what people go through when they make that decision to leave their home and leave their country and to try and go into the unknown. And I just wonder if this is a moment where Europe has misunderstood how to tackle the problem because of that overarching influence of, if you care about migration, you care about stopping something rather than finding a way to resolve an unstoppable problem. Their homeland is not somewhere they can stay.
Sure, yeah, no, absolutely. And first of all, there is no solid or consistent evidence that I'm aware of that suggests that harsher policies of deterrence do create a significant deterrent effect, as it were. And this is indeed because many people are fleeing conflict, persecution, or entrenched poverty. They don't make their migration decisions based on detailed knowledge of European migration policies. Their primary concern is safety, survival, and the future of their families, quite frankly. And we really need to bear in mind also the realities of the migration journeys that these individuals take. The IRC works with a lot of displaced people around the world and in Europe. And we see that many people seeking protection have risked their lives, putting their lives indeed in the hands of smugglers, undertaking dangerous sea crossings, walking through deserts and fearing extortion and so forth. So someone who's willing to take those kinds of risks, they're unlikely to be deterred by the potential risk of being transferred to a so-called return hub. And moreover, the previous speaker also referred to these hubs operating under EU jurisdiction and upholding human rights or fundamental rights. It's extremely difficult to see how that would happen. It's not at all clear how these hubs will operate, who will be accountable for the rights and well-being of the individuals inside of them, and how European policymakers can in any way guarantee the safety. But I'd like to also very briefly come back to, again, what the previous speaker alluded to, that if one cares about people on the move, one would want to implement, for instance, the return regulation. From our side, we see it differently. We do, of course, agree that an orderly migration system is needed, of course. But our concern is that the current approach focused primarily on detention and externalization. It's extremely expensive, as we know. We've seen the UK-Rwanda deal and how much that cost before it failed.
Okay.
But also, whilst this shows very limited evidence that it actually does create durable solutions, there are many other things that states need to do instead.
Nathalie, can I come to you for the last comment? We have about a minute left. If you can just give me a brief, then I'm sure everyone wants to know, will the pact work?
Again, will it work to actually govern migration into Europe? Frankly speaking, I have very, very low hopes. Will it work politically for European parties to the far right and the centre right, which have basically been those supporting this pact, to say that something is being done on migration? Maybe it will work, right? So I think, this entire conversation has really, put the focus on this complete mismatch between the actual practice of migration and governing migration and the political spin around it that particularly parties to the nationalist far right have been mobilising in Europe.
All right. Nathalie Tocci, a professor of practice at Johns Hopkins University, SAIS Europe, joining us from Rome. Marta Welander, EU Advocacy Director at International Rescue Committee, joining us from Brussels, and also from Brussels, Pieter Cleppe, Editor-in-Chief at BrusselsReport.eu. Thank you all. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For now, that's it from me, Anna Burns-Francis, and the team here. Al Jazeera's coverage continues in just a moment. Stay tuned.